Lord Jesus Christ, glory and praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to listen to Jesus. But the Pharisees and scribes began to complain, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So to them Jesus addressed this parable. A man had 2 sons, and the younger son said to his father, "Father, give me the share of your estate that should come to me." So the father divided the property between them. After a few days, the younger son collected all his belongings and set off to a distant country, where he squandered his inheritance on a life of dissipation. When he had freely spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he found himself in dire need. So he hired himself out to one of the local citizens, who sent him to his farm to tend the swine. And he longed to eat his fill of the pods on which the swine fed, but nobody gave him any. Coming to his senses, he thought, "How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food to eat? But here am I, dying from hunger. I shall get up and go to my father, and I shall say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as you would treat one of your hired workers.' So he got up and went back to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was filled with compassion. He ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son.' But his father ordered his servants, 'Quickly, bring the finest robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Take the fattened calf and slaughter it. Then let us celebrate with a feast, because this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found.' Then the celebration began. Now the older son had been out in the field, and on his way back, as he neared the house, he heard the sound of music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what this might mean. The servant said to him, 'Your brother has returned, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' He became angry, and when he refused to enter the house, his father came out and pleaded with him. He said to his father in reply, 'Look, all these years I served you, and not once did I disobey your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat to feast on with my friends. But when your son returns, who has swallowed up your property with prostitutes, for him you slaughter the fattened calf.' He said to him, 'My son, you are here with me always. Everything I have is yours. But now we must celebrate and rejoice, because your brother was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found.'" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In order to get into this powerful gospel account. I'd like to start with the story. The story is about Lucille Ball. Some of you will remember the I Love Lucy program, even if it was only in reruns. I once read that years later, during an award ceremony for Lucille Ball at the Kennedy Center in Washington, a message from Desi Arnaz, her husband from whom she had been divorced, was read to the audience. In it, he said, in praising Lucy's consummate skill as a comedian, that Lucy was the show. Viv, Fred, and I were just props. Good props, but props nevertheless. The two sons in the gospel parable we just heard are really props pointing to and accenting the Father. In other words, the story here is primarily about the Father and not the sons. And remember, the Father here represents God. In this chapter of Luke's Gospel, there are three parables: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. It's almost as if Jesus is responding to a question from his listeners. What is God really like? Please tell us. And he responds with these three verbal pictures. The story is more about love than it is about sin. Or I guess you could say that it's about what happens when divine love encounters sin. I recently came across an image of this. It's a story that was told by the late Benedictine monk and Cardinal Archbishop Basil Hume. He told the story of a priest who was beginning a funeral liturgy. And he started his homily with, "I'm going to preach about judgment." There were visible expressions of dismay amongst his congregants. Then he went on to say, "You know what judgment is? Judgment is whispering into the ear of a merciful and compassionate God the story of my life, which I had never been able to tell." Luke introduces this section of the gospel by saying, there was a man who had two sons. From the beginning, the focus is on the Father, although we do hear about the behavior of both sons. It's always in relation to the Father. After all, the Father made it possible for the younger son to leave in the first place. He gave him his inheritance. And the Father is the one who leaves the celebratory banquet at the end of the story to go out and plead with his elder son to come in. To the extent that this is about the sons, it's primarily about the sons as recipients of the Father's unbounded, unconditional compassion and love. Look at it this way. The Father's love is so strong that it can risk being weak and vulnerable. It can risk being hurt. When his younger son asks for his inheritance so he can leave home, there's no indication at all that the father rants and raves or attempts to lock him in his room. He's willing to let him go rather than forcibly try to possess him. His love is so strong that it makes no demands, but is willing to wait patiently. He waits, looks, and yearns for his son's return in order to welcome him home. He sees him coming from a distance. He's far off. He was always waiting and watching. he never turned his back on his son. In fact, at the end of the story, the father comes out of the house to plead with the older son to come in and join the festivities. And again, he never turns his back on him. There's an interesting detail. Did you ever notice that the story ends with the father remaining outside, waiting for his elder son to come in? Infinite patience, longing, and desire. The Father's love forgives and welcomes home unconditionally, always and everyone, including us. His love doesn't prevent us from leaving home for one distant land or another. Instead, paradoxically, it redeems the time spent there and the life lived in those places. Where sin abounded, grace has yet more abounded. This is really good news for those of us who, at one time or another, may have traveled to a distant country. Sometimes we're dragged there through circumstances and events not of our own making or choosing. Some, like the younger son, squander their inheritance. Some, like the elder son, simmer in silent resentment. Sorrow and grief can keep one in a distant country, or fear, shame, and embarrassment can keep others there. I can't help but wonder whether the younger son, as he journeyed back home, mentally prepared his confession, and that he also heard voices in his head saying such things as, "You don't really think you can go back home, do you? After what you've done, they don't want you there. They won't take you back. You aren't worthy. You never really were to begin with." Whatever the distant country is for us, and whatever the inner voices are that may scream in our heads, we somehow know we are starving for real life and real love. We know we're not ourselves in this distant place, at least not our true selves. Again, paradoxically, however, this is the grace of the distant country. While we may go there, we eventually come to ourselves, our true selves. We come to know that it's not a place where we want to remain. I shall get up and go to my Father. The Father knows that love is the only real way home. That's why the father in our parable runs to meet his son as soon as he sees him off in the distance. His love, his unconditional compassion, traverses the distance between them before the son's footsteps do. And then what does the son find? No recriminations at all. No explanations needed. Just the best robe, sandals, a ring, and then the banquet. The banquet. Brothers and sisters, the banquet is ready. Let us proceed with our Eucharist.